In the summer of 1940, over the skies of southeastern England, something became clear to every RAF pilot who survived long enough to understand it. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was faster, it climbed higher, and it turned with a precision that seemed almost inhuman. The British Spitfire and Hurricane were good machines, proud machines, but they were losing, not every engagement, but enough of them. Enough that graveyards were filling with young men who had done everything right and still didn't come home. Squadron leader James Whitmore had lost 17 pilots under his command in 6 weeks, not in combat mistakes or recklessness, in fair fights where the German aircraft simply had the advantage. He sat in the operations room at Hornchurch Airfield on a humid August afternoon, staring at the intelligence reports spread across the table. The technical data was frustrating in its simplicity. The Bf-109's engine, the Daimler-Benz DB601, produced more horsepower. Its fuel injection system gave it superior performance in negative G maneuvers. Its rate of climb was documented, calculated, undeniable. But Whitmore was not a man who accepted undeniable things. He was 53 years old, with grey threading through his moustache and a limp from a crash in 1918. He had flown Sopwith Camels over France when most of the current pilots were still in school uniforms. He understood machines the way some men understand music, not as objects to be operated, but as living systems with moods and secrets. And the Spitfire, he knew, had secrets that no one had bothered to excavate. In the pilot's ready room that evening, Whitmore called in a young flight lieutenant named Robert "Bobby" Chen, a half-Chinese pilot from Surrey, whose tactical instincts were sharp, but whose confidence had been eroding with each patrol that ended in a narrow escape. Chen arrived expecting a dressing down. Instead, Whitmore handed him a file marked "Engine Performance Analysis, Confidential." "The Germans are winning because we're thinking like engineers," Whitmore said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man delivering a verdict. "And they're thinking like engineers too. But I don't think like an engineer anymore, Bobby. I think like a tired old man who's seen 2 wars. And I believe the answer isn't in the engine. It's in how we use what we have." Chen watched as Whitmore pulled out a pencil and a small wooden box of matches from his desk drawer. The squadron leader scattered the matches across a map of the channel, arranging them in different patterns. "The Bf-109 has one fatal weakness," Whitmore continued, moving the matches into a tight formation. "It cannot stay in sustained combat over our territory for long. Fuel burn in combat is different from fuel burn in cruise. The math says it can stay for 40 minutes of active engagement, but the math, Bobby, is written by men in offices, not by pilots who are bleeding and afraid and pulling their aircraft through maneuvers that shouldn't be possible." He looked up at Chen with eyes that had seen too much sky. "Tomorrow, I want you to fly a practice intercept with me. Not against a Bf-109, against the mathematics of exhaustion. And I want you to think about this. What if the Messerschmitt's strength isn't strength at all? What if it's a trap we've been walking into because we're trying to beat them at their own game?" Chen left that night unable to sleep. He read the engine specifications until the words blurred, then walked out to the dispersal where the Spitfires sat in moonlight, their elliptical wings casting shadows like dark thoughts. The next morning, Whitmore and Chen flew their first experimental patrol. They did not chase enemy aircraft. They flew in a pattern that Whitmore had designed using nothing but his experience and those matchsticks on a map. Climb to 22,000 feet. Cruise at conservative power settings. Hold position over Dover. Wait. At 10:45 hours, radar reported Bf-109s inbound from Calais. What happened in the next 12 minutes would not appear in official records for more than 30 years. The technical analysis, the fuel consumption data, the turn radius calculations, all of it would be filed away in archives that seemed designed to be forgotten. But Bobby Chen would spend the rest of his life understanding what Squadron Leader Whitmore had discovered in that terrible, brilliant moment, that war is not won by the fastest aircraft or the strongest engine. War is won by the man who understands that every advantage contains the seed of its own defeat. The Messerschmitt pilot that morning had superior speed, superior climb, superior turn radius. But he also had a clock ticking inside his fuel tanks. And he didn't know that Squadron Leader Whitmore had spent 40 years learning to read clocks that were written in mathematics no textbook had yet dared to print. The German pilot never made it back to Calais. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. Within 3 days of that first interception, Squadron Leader Whitmore's approach had a name among the pilots: the exhaustion tactic. It was not a tactic born from official doctrine. It was born from a man who had learned that wars are not won by those who build the best machines, but by those who understand the human cost of running those machines to their absolute limit. The secret was deceptively simple, and it was devastating. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 was engineered for everything except longevity. Its climb rate was superior because its engine ran at higher temperatures and pressures. Its speed was superior because every ounce of fuel was burned with aggressive efficiency. But that same aggressive efficiency meant that a pilot in combat, actually fighting, turning hard, diving, climbing in evasive maneuvers, consumed fuel at rates that no comfortable mathematics accounted for. Whitmore had calculated it using nothing more sophisticated than a mechanical pencil and paper covered in coffee stains. He had interviewed 7 pilots who had survived engagements with Bf-109s. He had read maintenance reports from damaged German aircraft that had been recovered. He had walked through hangar workshops at night, studying fuel system designs, pressure regulators, carburetors, and the precise specifications of Daimler-Benz engines that had been photographed and analyzed by British intelligence. And then he had taken those matchsticks and drawn the truth on a map. By August 20th, 1940, a formal memo appeared on the desk of Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, the commanding officer of RAF Fighter Command 11 Group. The memo was unsigned but bore Whitmore's distinctive handwriting. It contained 3 pages of calculations, 7 diagrams, and a recommendation that would change the course of the air war over Britain. The recommendation was this: do not pursue Messerschmitts over the Channel or over enemy territory. Pursue them over British airspace, at altitudes above 20,000 feet, using a flight pattern that maximizes endurance while minimizing fuel consumption. Force them to engage, then disengage at precise moments when their fuel reserves reach critical thresholds. The Bf-109 will be forced to attempt the return journey to France or Belgium with insufficient fuel for combat or evasive action. Park read it in silence, then he read it again. "This is supposition," he said to his adjutant, but his voice carried the tone of a man who knew supposition when supposition was backed by 30 years of flying experience and the mathematics of survival. Bobby Chen was assigned to lead the first official trial of Whitmore's method. 5 Spitfires under Chen's command would conduct a series of patrols over the Thames estuary and the Kent coastline, following a specific altitude profile and fuel management protocol. They were not authorized to pursue enemy aircraft aggressively. They were authorized only to maintain patrol integrity and intercept as opportunity permits. What Whitmore had actually designed was a trap made of mathematics and exhaustion. On August 22nd, at 11:30 hours, Chen's flight detected 3 Bf-109s approaching from the southeast. The German fighters climbed toward Chen's formation, exactly as Whitmore had predicted they would. The German pilots were trained to seek advantage through superior altitude and energy state. They could not ignore a British fighter formation. To ignore it was to cede control of the airspace. Chen did not climb to meet them. Instead, he held his altitude at 19,500 feet and maintained a northwesterly heading at a fuel-efficient power setting. The Bf-109s, forced to catch him from below, burned fuel at a rate that was ruthlessly efficient but ultimately suicidal. What followed was 43 minutes of maneuvering. The German pilots were skilled, extraordinarily skilled. They outturned Chen's Spitfires in 3 separate engagements. They achieved tactical advantage in altitude and positioning on 4 occasions, but they could not disengage. To disengage was to admit defeat. To disengage was to abandon the airspace to British fighters. At 12:13 hours, the first Bf-109 turned toward France with its fuel warning light illuminated. At 12:17 hours, the second one followed. The third German pilot attempted one final aggressive pass, a maneuver that burned the last of his usable fuel in a desperate effort to achieve a killing position. He didn't achieve it. He did achieve a crash landing in a harvested wheat field near Ashford, where he ejected and was captured by a Home Guard unit within 2 hours. The pilot's name was Oberführer Klaus Reichmann, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War with 47 confirmed kills. In the interrogation room at Hornchurch, speaking through a translator, Reichmann kept repeating the same phrase. The Spitfire did nothing. It simply refused to fight. It simply refused to give us the fuel to survive. Whitmore was standing in the observation room, watching through the glass. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The Matchsticks had spoken in a language that was older than mathematics, the language of exhaustion, of patience, of understanding that the strongest opponent is the one who refuses to engage on the opponent's terms. By the end of August 1940, RAF Fighter Command had officially incorporated Whitmore's method into combat doctrine. Within 6 weeks, the loss ratio over southeastern England had shifted noticeably in favor of the British. The Messerschmitts were still superior machines in almost every measurable way, but they were now fighting an enemy that understood how to make superiority irrelevant. If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. September 1940 brought a change to the rhythm of the air war over Britain. The Luftwaffe, sensing that something in their tactical advantage had shifted, changed their approach. Longer-range escorts, higher fuel reserve protocols, coordination with Italian fighters operating from French bases, but none of it mattered. Because Whitmore had already understood the fundamental truth that the Germans were still too distracted to fully grasp. You cannot escape the laws of physics through better planning. The Messerschmitt would always burn fuel faster than the Spitfire in sustained combat. This was not a tactical problem. This was an engineering problem. And engineering problems, Whitmore knew, could be solved if you were willing to wait long enough. He began keeping detailed records, not official records. Those were archived with the normal procedures of military bureaucracy. These were personal records, kept in a leather journal that he filled during evening hours in his quarters at Hornchurch. Each page documented fuel consumption rates under different atmospheric conditions, different altitudes, different combat scenarios. He interviewed pilots after each engagement. He collected maintenance records from the engineering sections. He even obtained, through channels that remained deliberately vague, autopsy reports on German pilots who had been killed in crashes related to fuel exhaustion. The data accumulated into something that transcended mere military intelligence. It became a portrait of exhaustion itself, a map of the precise moment when human physiology, aircraft engineering, and mathematical necessity converged into failure. By mid-September, Whitmore had calculated that a Messerschmitt pilot operating at combat efficiency over British territory had approximately 41 minutes of usable fuel from the moment of tactical engagement to the moment of safe return to French airspace. That calculation accounted for Initial climbing to intercept altitude, consuming 12% of fuel reserves, combat maneuvering at high power settings, consuming 8–12% per minute depending on maneuver intensity, reserve fuel for return journey, minimum 15% to ensure safe cruise back to base. Weather contingencies and navigation uncertainty, 5% minimum buffer. The mathematics was elegant in its cruelty. 41 minutes. Not 42, not 40. 41 minutes of sustainable engagement before the physics of combustion and the geography of the English Channel made continued combat mathematically impossible. Whitmore shared this calculation with Bobby Chen on a rain-soaked afternoon in mid-September. They were standing in the dispersal area, watching ground crews service the Spitfires. The rain fell with that particular intensity that seemed to suggest autumn had already decided to arrive early. 41 minutes, Whitmore repeated, as if the number itself contained revelation. That's the window, Bobby. That's where we live now. Not in speed or turn radius or horsepower. We live in the 41 minutes when the Messerschmitt is forced to choose between fighting us and surviving the journey home. Chen was lighting a cigarette, his hands steadier now than they had been 6 weeks earlier. What happens if they refuse to fight? What if they simply turn back? Then they cede the airspace, Whitmore said. And if they cede the airspace often enough, they lose the war. Because war isn't won by superior aircraft, Bobby. War is won by controlling territory. And territory is controlled by whoever can stay in the sky longer than the other fellow. Over the next 3 weeks, Whitmore refined his calculations further. He worked with the engineering officers to analyze fuel consumption rates under extreme conditions. He flew experimental sorties with different power settings and climb profiles. He even conducted mathematical analysis of German fighter tactics based on eyewitness reports from damaged Bf-109s that had limped back to French bases. What emerged was not just a tactic, it was a system, a methodology for converting mathematical advantage into military advantage. The system was based on a principle so fundamental that it seemed almost insultingly simple. Make the enemy choose between two things he could not have: superiority and survival. The Messerschmitt possessed superiority, but that superiority required fuel. The moment the German pilot committed to using that superiority in sustained combat over British airspace, the fuel reserves began an inexorable countdown. 41 minutes, then 30, then 20. Then the desperation sets in, the moment when superior speed and turn radius mean nothing, because the only mission that matters is getting home alive. By late September, the system had been tested in 17 documented engagements. The results were consistent. Messerschmitt pilots operating under Whitmore's combat envelope either disengaged early, ceding airspace control to the RAF, or remained in combat until fuel reserves forced them into desperation maneuvers that made them vulnerable to attack. The loss ratio had shifted so dramatically that Air Vice Marshal Park personally visited Hornchurch to observe one of the patrols. He watched from the control room as Bobby Chen's flight detected Bf-109s inbound, climbed to intercept altitude, and then executed a maneuver that seemed on the surface almost like retreat. The German fighters pursued. They climbed. They maneuvered. They burned fuel at the precise rate that Whitmore had calculated they would burn it. And then, exactly as predicted, they turned toward France. Park turned to Whitmore, who was standing quietly beside him. "This is mathematics," Park said. "This is mathematics," Whitmore agreed. "And mathematics, sir, is a language that both sides speak equally well. The only advantage is to the man who has learned to listen to it most carefully." By October 1940, the German High Command had recognized that something fundamental had changed in the air war over Britain. Luftwaffe pilots were being forced to engage British fighters under conditions that eliminated their technological advantage. Fuel conservation became a tactical liability. The moment a German pilot conserved fuel, he was no longer using his aircraft to its full capability. The moment he used his aircraft to full capability, he no longer had fuel to survive the return journey. The trap, once built, could not be unbuilt. The response from Berlin was methodical and, in its own way, inevitable. If the Messerschmitt's range was insufficient, then range must be extended. Within 3 weeks, drop tanks were being fitted to Bf-109s. Within 6 weeks, longer-range fighter variants were being expedited into production. But these modifications took time. And time, as the autumn of 1940 progressed, was a commodity that Germany could no longer afford to waste. Whitmore understood this. Though he did not speak of it openly, he understood that his system had an expiration date. Every solution, pressed hard enough, eventually generates its own counter-solution. The matchsticks on the map had served their purpose. Now the war would move into a different phase, one measured in production capacity, in industrial output, in the grinding mathematics of attrition rather than tactical elegance. But there was a price for his understanding. And that price began to extract itself in ways that no system of combat tactics could account for. Bobby Chen came to Whitmore's quarters on a cold evening in October. The young pilot looked as if he hadn't slept in days. His hands shook slightly as he sat across from Whitmore, accepting a glass of whiskey that he held but did not drink. "I've been thinking about the mathematics," Chen said quietly. "The 41 minutes. I've been flying patrols based on that calculation for 6 weeks now, and I keep thinking about what happens when the calculation is wrong." Whitmore lit his pipe, the tobacco smoke curling upward in the dim light of his desk lamp. "The calculation is accurate," he said. "I know it is," Chen replied. "That's what's been keeping me awake. Because if the calculation is accurate, then the Messerschmitt pilots know it too. They know exactly how much fuel they have. They know exactly when they have to disengage. They know that they're flying into a system designed to make them desperate." "Yes," Whitmore said. He did not soften this acknowledgement with comfort or qualification. "So what happens when desperation becomes a virtue?" Chen continued. "What happens when a pilot decides that the calculation is meaningless, that dying over England is the same as dying over France? What happens when the mathematics encounters a man who has decided that the only acceptable outcome is a victory, regardless of whether he survives to claim it?" Whitmore did not answer immediately. He smoked his pipe and looked at Chen with eyes that suddenly seemed very old indeed. "That," Whitmore finally said, "is the moment when a system of tactics becomes a system of ethics. And I have no answer for that question, Bobby. I only have the knowledge that I created a weapon, and every weapon eventually meets a man who is willing to die wielding it." In the following weeks, the nature of the air combat over southern England began to shift again. The Luftwaffe, recognizing that fuel advantage had been negated by tactical doctrine, began flying escort missions with a different calculus. German pilots began making deliberate decisions to engage in sustained combat, even when fuel reserves made survival mathematically unlikely. These were not errors of judgment. These were deliberate tactical choices, a recognition that mathematics could be overridden by will, by determination, by a willingness to accept death as a cost of denying the RAF control of British airspace. The loss rates increased for both sides. Whitmore continued to refine his calculations. He continued to file reports. He continued to observe the patrols and debrief the pilots. But something had changed in him, a recognition that had settled into his bones, like cold that wouldn't warm. He had created a system that worked. He had created a system so effective that the enemy had begun to accept suicidal costs to counter it. He had created a system that killed men more efficiently by preventing them from killing efficiently. By late October, exhaustion had become visible in Whitmore's face. His hands trembled slightly when he held a teacup. He stopped attending the evening briefings. He spent his time walking the perimeter of the airfield, watching the Spitfires being maintained and fueled, and prepared for the next day's sorties. On October 31st, Bobby Chen found him standing in the rain near the dispersal, watching a Spitfire being refueled. The liquid fuel poured into the tank with the clarity of water, and Whitmore watched it with an expression that Chen had come to recognize as recognition of something that could not be unknowns once it had been understood. "I've calculated the consequences," Whitmore said without preamble. "Do you know how many men will die because of the mathematics I've created?" "No," Chen said. "Neither do I," Whitmore replied. "And that is the precise price of engineering a system that works. It works so efficiently that the cost becomes impossible to calculate. The cost spreads across so many individual moments, so many individual pilots, so many individual decisions to engage in combat, knowing that survival has become mathematically unlikely. The cost becomes diffuse. It becomes invisible. It becomes something that can be filed away in archives and called tactical innovation." Chen said nothing. There was nothing to say. Both men understood that they were standing at a moment in history where mathematics and morality had collided and mathematics had won. Both men understood that this victory would echo forward through the remainder of the war, through the remainder of their lives, and into decades of silence where the archives would remain sealed and the calculations would remain secret. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video. The war ended in 1945, but the mathematics continued. Squadron leader James Whitmore was reassigned in November 1940, shortly after his tactical innovations had been formally incorporated into RAF doctrine. He spent the remainder of the war training new pilots in what had by then become standardized combat procedures. His name appeared in no official histories. His calculations were archived in files marked technical analysis, classification level restricted, and were not declassified until 1973. Bobby Chen survived the war. He flew 127 combat missions, achieved 12 confirmed kills, and was decorated twice for bravery. In interviews conducted after the war, interviews that were sealed and not released until 2001, Chen spoke about his experiences under Whitmore's system. He described it as the most brilliant and the most terrible thing I had ever participated in, because it was not brilliant in the way that heroism is brilliant. It was brilliant in the way that mathematics is brilliant, and mathematics, you see, doesn't care about heroism. It only cares about being accurate. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 remained in production through the end of the European War. The drop tanks that were fitted to extend its range never fully compensated for the tactical disadvantage that Whitmore's calculations had created. Historians would later attribute the gradual shift in air superiority over Britain to a complex combination of factors: increased British fighter production, better pilot training, technical improvements to the Spitfire. None of these histories emphasize the role of a system designed entirely around the mathematics of exhaustion. In 1972, a technical historian named Dr. Edmund Hartley was granted access to the classified archives containing Whitmore's original calculations and tactical recommendations. Hartley spent 6 months analyzing the documents. He then published a paper titled "The Calculus of Aerial Combat: Fuel Consumption as a Determinant of Tactical Outcome in the Battle of Britain." The paper was published in an obscure academic journal and attracted minimal attention. It contained the first public acknowledgement of Whitmore's mathematical innovations, though Whitmore's name was not mentioned, still protected by classification protocols that would not fully expire until 1985. Whitmore himself had died in 1968, quietly, without public recognition or historical acknowledgement. His obituary in the Times mentioned only that he was a distinguished RAF officer who had served with honor. There was no mention of Matchsticks, There was no mention of mathematics. There was no mention of the moment when he had recognized that he had created a weapon that transcended simple military technology and had become something closer to a system of organized exhaustion. Bobby Chen died in 2003. His final interview, recorded just weeks before his death, was broadcast on BBC Radio 4 as part of a documentary series about lesser-known figures of the Battle of Britain. In that interview, Chen spoke about Whitmore for the first time publicly, though he did so with careful language that suggested he was still conscious of classification protocols long since expired. He understood something that most of us never learned, Chen said in that final recording. He understood that war is not won by superiority. War is won by refusing to engage the enemy on terms that the enemy has chosen. Squadron leader Whitmore taught us that the most powerful weapon is not the fastest aircraft or the strongest gun. The most powerful weapon is patience. The most powerful weapon is mathematics. The most powerful weapon is knowing exactly when and how to make the enemy exhaust himself while you remain intact. The matchsticks were never documented in any official history. They were never photographed. They were never preserved as a symbol of tactical innovation. They were simply matchsticks that a tired old pilot had scattered across a map on a humid August afternoon in 1940, and they had contained within them the solution to a war. The archives remain open now more than 80 years after Whitmore scattered those matchsticks. The calculations are available for any historian or engineer to study. The tactical doctrine is taught in military academies as a case study in the application of mathematics to combat. But the human cost, the precise weight of exhaustion that the system created, the number of men who died because they had been forced to choose between survival and engagement, this remains locked in a silence that even the declassification of documents could not breach. Because some mathematics, once mastered, cannot be unmade. Some systems, once created, cannot be deconstructed. And some wars, once understood at the level of pure calculation, can never be seen as heroic again. They can only be seen as they actually are. The collision of mathematics and mortality, where neither side achieves victory, where both sides only exhaust themselves more efficiently than before. The Messerschmitt and the Spitfire are both in museums now. The pilots who flew them have passed into history. The matchsticks have long since been burned or discarded, but the mathematics remains, the calculation remains, the understanding that war is not won by the strongest, but by the one who has learned to make strength irrelevant. This remains as a quiet knowledge in the archives, waiting for the next generation to discover it and perhaps to finally understand what the cost of that discovery will be.